the world knows Delphi. They know the Oracle, the Pythia, the myths, the strange prophecies. But what if most of what we think we know is just the surface? What if the real story is messier, more human, and far more complex than the myths suggest? The Oracle of Delphi shaped empires. It influenced wars, migrations, and laws. Kings and commoners traveled for months to stand before its power. But how did it really work? Was it truly divine? Or was something else going on? Something much more grounded, even a bit mundane behind the grandeur? We talk about the Pythia speaking in tongues, about the gas-filled chasm, about Apollo's sacred wisdom. But did you know that Pythia was often a simple peasant woman? Did you know the famous prophecies were often a team effort, shaped and polished by powerful male priests? Did you know Delphi was as much a bank as it was a holy site? This place high on Mount Parnassus held secrets for over 1,000 years. Some secrets died with the last priest, but others, carefully pieced together by archaeologists, historians, and even geologists, give us a different picture. A picture where politics, money, and human cunning played as big a role as divine inspiration. Get ready to rethink everything you thought you knew about the Oracle. Number 21. Did the Pythia really speak in a trance, or was it more of a performance? People picture the Pythia, the Oracle herself, in a wild, foaming trance. They imagine her uttering gibberish, a conduit for Apollo's voice. This image comes from some ancient accounts, especially later ones. But it might not be the whole truth, or even most of it. Many modern scholars think the trance was less dramatic than often portrayed. It might have been more a state of heightened emotion, a ritualized performance rather than a full-blown fit. Take Plutarch, for example. He was a priest at Delphi himself in the late 1st and early 2nd centuries AD. He wrote a lot about the oracle. In his essays, like on the obsolescence of oracles and the oracles at Delphi no longer given in verse, he describes the Pythia as being in a different state. And he talks about a pneuma, a spirit or vapor, affecting her. But he doesn't always describe her as completely out of control. He suggests she was still understandable. She spoke, sometimes in simple prose, not always in wild, poetic riddles. The idea of total gibberish might have been a later addition, making the oracle seem more mystical and less human. Early sources like Herodotus from the 5th century BC describe the Pythia giving clear answers, though often ambiguous. When Croesus, the king of Lydia, asked if he should attack Persia, the oracle told him that a great empire will be destroyed. He thought it meant the Persian Empire. It turned out to be his own. This wasn't gibberish. It was a calculated, open-ended answer. The Pythia's role required dignity and understanding. She sat on the tripod, inhaling something, yes, but her prophecies needed to be interpreted by the male priests, the propheti. If she was always just screaming nonsense, how could they consistently turn it into coherent, often politically astute verse? Dr. Lisa Maurizio, a classical scholar, has written extensively on the Pythia's role. She argues that the Pythia was a skilled ritualist. She was not just a passive vessel. She had to navigate complex questions and maintain the oracle's authority. This suggests a controlled state, not always a chaotic one. Think of it this way. If a politician goes to a religious leader for advice, they expect something they can use, right? They don't want just random sounds. The Pythia's trance was likely a spectrum. Sometimes it might have been more intense, sometimes less, but it always served a purpose to deliver Apollo's message in a way that kept the oracle powerful and respected. The performance aspect was crucial. It created an atmosphere of awe. It separated the Pythia from normal people. But it didn't mean she lost all control or understanding. What if the Pythia herself had some training in how to phrase answers? What if the trance was a carefully cultivated psychological state, not just a spontaneous happening? How much of the Pythia's behavior was learned, and how much was truly involuntary? Were there different levels of trance, depending on the importance of the question or the person asking? Number 20, how much did money and politics really drive Delphi's prophecies? People like to think the oracle was pure, untouched by earthly concerns, but Delphi was a huge economic and political powerhouse. This was not a small, quiet temple. It was a massive complex, a city of its own, full of treasuries. These treasuries held immense wealth, gifts from kings and city-states across the Mediterranean. Gold, silver, statues, armor board, and the offerings were staggering. This wealth meant power. The oracle wasn't just a spiritual guide, it was a central bank of sorts. City-states would deposit their surplus wealth there for safekeeping. They funded projects and wars with loans from Delphi. Think about the economic impact of pilgrimage. Thousands of people came every year. They bought food, lodging, offerings, they spent money. This supported a whole economy in the region. Professor Michael Scott, in his book Delphi, A History of the Center of the Ancient World, details just how much the oracle was integrated into the wider Greek economy and politics. He shows it was a major player, and with that kind of economic power comes political influence. The oracle's pronouncements often had huge political implications. Should Athens go to war with Sparta? Should new colonies be founded? The oracle's advice carried immense weight. Sometimes the advice conveniently aligned with the interests of certain powerful families or city-states who were also major donors to the temple. For example, during the Persian Wars, the oracle initially gave very discouraging prophecies to the Athenians. It told them to flee their city, saying all is lost. This could have led to a quick surrender. But after more prayers and offerings, a second, more hopeful prophecy came. It advised them to trust in their wooden walls, which Themistocles, the Athenian leader, interpreted as their fleet of ships. This prophecy rallied the Athenians. It encouraged them to fight at sea, leading to the decisive victory at Salamis. Was this a genuine change of heart by Apollo, or was it clever political maneuvering by the priests, responding to Athenian pressure and their deep pockets? The Amphictyonic League, a council of 12 Greek tribes, managed the sanctuary. This council wasn't just religious, it was a political body. It controlled the vast wealth and defended the oracle's autonomy. It even fought wars, the sacred wars, to protect Delphi's interests. This shows just how intertwined politics and religion were at Delphi. The priests and the Pythia were not operating in a vacuum. They were deeply embedded in the complex web of Greek power. The oracle had to be seen as neutral, but neutrality then as now was a difficult thing to maintain when surrounded by so much power and money. Could the priests have subtly influenced the Pythia, or at least the interpretation of her words, to favor certain political outcomes that benefited Delphi's prestige or economic standing? How much of the oracle's famous ambiguity was a safeguard against being wrong, and how much was it a tool for political flexibility? Did the biggest donors get a better chance at a favorable prophecy? Number 19. What was the Pythia's real selection process, and why does it matter? Most people imagine the Pythia was chosen randomly, plucked from obscurity by divine will. The common story says she was a local peasant woman, perhaps elderly, simple, and pure. While often a local woman, the selection process was more structured than that. It mattered a lot because her background and status affected how people perceived her authority and the oracle's legitimacy. We know from ancient sources, including Diodorus Siculus, a Greek historian from the 1st century BC, that there were specific requirements. The Pythia had to be a local Delphian. She had to be of good character, and crucially, she had to live a chaste life. Originally, she might have been a young virgin, but one story tells of a young Pythia being abducted by a consultant from Thessaly. After this, the rule changed. Pythias had to be older, around 50 years old, or at least past childbearing age. If she was younger, she would wear the traditional dress of a maiden to uphold the symbolic purity. This change is important. It shows the oracle was adapting, responding to real-world problems. It wasn't just rigid tradition, it cared about its image and the safety of its priestess. Selecting an older woman meant she was less likely to be seen as a sexual object. It also meant she was more likely to be respected for her wisdom and experience within her community. A woman in her 50s would have lived a life. She would have seen things. She would have a certain gravitas. The Pythia was also required to be illiterate. This reinforced the idea that her words were not her own. They came from Apollo. If she couldn't read or write, she couldn't formulate complex ideas or manipulate the prophecies herself. It made her seem like a cleaner vessel for the divine. Parquet and Wormel's comprehensive work, The Delphic Oracle, provides a lot of detail on these selection criteria and the evolution of the Pythia's role over time. They emphasize that the Pythia wasn't just a random person, she was carefully chosen to fit a specific public image and functional role. So the Pythia wasn't just any woman. She was a woman chosen to embody certain ideals, local, chaste, pure, and humble enough to be a mouthpiece for a god. Her simplicity wasn't just a default, it was a deliberate part of her chosen persona. This helped maintain the illusion of divine purity. It helped reinforce the idea that her words were not her own, not from her personal wisdom, but truly from Apollo. If the Pythia was illiterate, how much of her initial pronouncements were purely spontaneous, and how much was influenced by what she overheard in daily life in Delphi? Did the criteria for choosing a Pythia evolve further during periods of crisis or decline for the Oracle? How did the Pythia herself feel about her role, especially if she had no say in her selection? Number 18 was the Omphalos stone. Just a symbol, or did it have a deeper, lost meaning? The Omphalos, or navel stone, is one of the most iconic symbols of Delphi. It sits in the museum there now. It's often described as marking the center of the world, where Zeus's two eagles met after flying from opposite ends of the earth. It was a powerful symbol, a visual anchor for Delphi's claim as the world's spiritual hub. But was it just a symbol, or did it have a more practical or even mystical function that we've lost? The Omphalos was placed near the Adyton, the inner sanctuary where the Pythia gave her prophecies. Some theories suggest it wasn't just a marker. Some propose it was a conduit. Ancient Greeks believed in telluric currents, or energies from the earth. The Omphalos, positioned on a geological fault line, could have been seen as a focal point for these energies. It's a striking, egg-shaped stone, sometimes depicted wrapped in wool, which adds to its ancient, almost primeval feel. Think about the context. Delphi was built on seismic activity. Modern geological studies, especially by J.Z. DeBoer and J.R. Hale, have confirmed the presence of active fault lines beneath the temple. They found evidence of various gases like ethylene, methane, and carbon dioxide seeping from these faults. While the specific narcotic gases theory has been debated, more on that later, the idea of earth energies and the Omphalos acting as a receiver for them isn't far-fetched for ancient beliefs. The navel concept itself is significant. A navel connects a child to its mother. It's a source of life. For Delphi to be the world's navel meant it was the source of life, wisdom, and prophecy for the entire world. It was the point of connection between the human and the divine, between the physical world and the cosmic order. Professor Robert Parker, an expert in Greek religion, discusses the Omphalos as a central cult object, reinforcing Delphi's cosmic importance. It wasn't just a pretty rock, it was a loaded piece of theology. Some researchers have even speculated about acoustic properties. Could the Omphalos have amplified sounds, or focused the Pythia's voice, creating a resonant chamber effect in the small Adyton? This is purely speculative, but given the careful architectural design of ancient temples, it's not impossible that sound played a role in the experience. The Omphalos served to ground the oracle's power, literally and symbolically. It made Delphi not just a place, but the place, the center of everything. It gave a physical manifestation to the abstract idea of divine connection. If the Omphalos was meant to channel earth energies, did its position or material properties enhance the Pythia's trance? Were there ever other Omphalos stones in other ancient sites, suggesting a wider practice of marking sacred centers? What happened to the Omphalos during the various destructions and rebuildings of the temple? Was it always preserved and replaced? Number 17, what was the true role of the male priests and how much power did they wield? We often focus on the Pythia. She was the star, the mouthpiece of Apollo. But behind every Pythia were powerful male priests called propheti. Their role was far from secondary. They were the interpreters, the administrators, and arguably the true power brokers of Delphi. Their influence was immense. The Pythia spoke, but often her words were disjointed oracles delivered in a state of altered consciousness. It was the job of the propheti to take these utterances and shape them into coherent, usually hexameter verse. This was a sophisticated task. It required not just poetic skill, but also a deep understanding of the question asked, the political context, and the desired outcome. This interpretive process gave them enormous power. They could subtly, or not so subtly, steer the prophecy in a certain direction. Plutarch, the Delphian priest we mentioned before, confirms the role of these male priests. He writes that they were responsible for recording and transmitting the prophecies. They were educated men, often from prominent Delphian families. They weren't just scribes, they were highly respected religious figures. They mediated between the divine Pythia and the mortal consultant. Think about it this way, a direct line from a god would be hard to challenge. But an interpretation that leaves room for human agency. The priests had knowledge of past prophecies, of political alliances, of the personalities of the consultants. They knew the historical precedents. They could use this knowledge to craft responses that maintained the oracle's reputation, supported Delphi's interests, and often steered Greek politics in a direction they approved of. Historian H.W. Park notes that the priests were integral to the oracle's success. Without their organizational skills, their diplomatic prowess, and their ability to translate divine ramblings into actionable advice, the oracle would not have lasted as long as it did. They maintained the continuity and authority of the institution. They handled the money, the upkeep of the temple, and the complex schedule of consultations. The priests also acted as a gatekeeper. Not everyone could simply walk up to the Pythia. There were rituals, offerings, and fees to pay. The priests managed this entire process, deciding who got access and when. This further consolidated their power. They were the interface between the sacred and the secular. Was there ever a conflict between the Pythia's original words and the priest's interpretation? Did the priests ever face accusations of manipulating prophecies? And if so, how did they handle it? What happened if a priest disagreed with another's interpretation of a prophecy? Number 16. The sacred way wasn't just a path, it was a story in stone. Most visitors to Delphi today walk the sacred way. They see the ruins, they know it's a path to the temple. But for an ancient pilgrim, it was much more. It was a carefully designed journey, a narrative in stone, filled with messages and challenges meant to prepare the consultant for their encounter with the divine. It wasn't just about getting from point A to point B. The sacred way was lined with treasuries. These were small, temple-like buildings erected by various Greek city-states. Each treasury was a display of wealth and power. It held offerings dedicated to Apollo, often spoils from military victories. The Athenians, the Siphnians, the Corinthians each wanted to outdo the others. As a pilgrim walked past, they saw this immense display of power and piety. They saw the tangible evidence of Apollo's influence and the respect he commanded from the most powerful states. This would have been awe-inspiring, a deliberate psychological preparation. It showed the god's reach. Professor Robin Osborne, a classicist, points out that the layout of the sanctuary itself was designed to impress. The winding path meant that the temple of Apollo would appear and disappear from view, building anticipation. The statues and monuments told stories of heroes, gods, and historical events. These weren't just decorative. They were didactic. They reinforced Greek values, celebrated great deeds, and reminded pilgrims of their place in the cosmic order. Think about the serpent column, originally from Constantinople, but its base stood at Delphi. It commemorated the Greek victory over the Persians at Plataea. Walking past this, a consultant would remember the god's favor in protecting Greece. And every step was part of a larger lesson, a reminder of Apollo's power and Delphi's central role in Greek history. The sheer scale of the offerings also highlights the wealth flowing into Delphi. The treasuries of Athens and Sipnos, for example, were magnificent structures, adorned with intricate sculptures. The Siphnian treasury in particular was famous for its rich friezes depicting mythological battles and scenes of divine judgment. This art wasn't just for beauty, it was part of the immersive experience, telling stories that reinforced the oracle's authority. The sacred way was also a place of ritual. Pilgrims would cleanse themselves, make preliminary offerings, and engage in specific practices before they could approach the main temple. And it was a carefully controlled progression from the mundane world to the sacred presence of Apollo. The journey itself was a pilgrimage, not just a stroll. It was a physical manifestation of seeking wisdom, with every step building tension and expectation. Did the specific order of the treasuries along the sacred way convey a deliberate message or historical timeline? How did the visual propaganda of the statues and offerings affect the mindset of consultants seeking a prophecy? Were there specific points along the sacred way where pilgrims were expected to stop and reflect before proceeding? Number 15 was the famous pneuma, a specific gas, or something more complex. For centuries, people believed that the Pythia's trance was caused by a specific vapor, a pneuma, rising from a chasm in the earth. Ancient authors like Strabo and Diodorus Siculus mention this, but for a long time, modern archaeologists and geologists found no evidence of such a chasm or gases. This led many to dismiss the idea entirely. They thought the Pythia's trance was either faked or induced by psychological means or possibly hallucinogenic plants. Then came the late 20th and early 21st centuries. A team of scientists, including geologist Jel DeBoer, archaeologist John Hale, and chemist Jeffrey Spiller, revisited Delphi with new tools. The research, published in scientific journals and discussed in books like The Oracle, The Lost Secrets, and Hidden History of Ancient Delphi, changed things. They confirmed that the Temple of Apollo sits directly on two major geological fault lines, the Delphi Fault and the Kurna Fault. Where these faults intersect, hydrocarbon gases, specifically ethylene, can escape from the limestone. Ethylene is a sweet-smelling gas that, in moderate doses, can act as a narcotic. It can induce a trance-like state, a feeling of detachment, and even euphoria. Ancient doctors knew it as a mild anesthetic. The researchers proposed that small amounts of ethylene, mixed with other gases like methane and carbon dioxide, could have been rising from fissures in the bedrock directly beneath the temple's adyton where the Pythia sat. This theory doesn't suggest a huge gaping chasm. Instead, it proposes narrow fissures, perhaps filled with water, allowing the gases to accumulate in the confined space of the adyton. The Pythia would have inhaled these gases, experiencing an altered state. This wasn't necessarily a violent, uncontrollable frenzy. It could have been a calm, dissociative state where her mind felt open to divine messages. However, the ethylene theory is not universally accepted. Some scholars still argue that the amounts of gas would have been too small, or that the specific geology might not support a continuous flow. Others point to the variability of the oracle's performance over centuries. The gas emissions would not have been constant. The debate continues, showing how complex it is to reconstruct ancient practices with modern science. But the geological evidence does point to the possibility of natural gas emissions at Delphi. It forces us to reconsider the purely psychological or fake trance theories. What if the specific type of gas changed over time due to seismic activity, leading to different forms of trance or prophecy? Could the priests have found ways to control or enhance the gas flow, or concentrate it in the adyton? If the gas theory is true, did other ancient oracles also rely on similar geological phenomena? Number 14 was Delphi, a pre-Apollonian site dedicated to an earth goddess. We associate Delphi almost exclusively with Apollo. He's the sun god, the god of light, music, and prophecy. But the story of Delphi goes back further than Apollo, much further. Before Apollo, the site was likely sacred to Gaia, the Earth Mother. This older, chthonic earth-based tradition is a significant secret, because it tells us about the layers of belief and conquest that shaped ancient Greek religion. Myth says that Apollo came to Delphi, slew the great serpent Python, or a child of Gaia, and established his own cult there. This myth can be read as an allegorical tale of the shift in religious power. It represents the Olympian gods like Apollo taking precedence over the older, more primal earth deities. Gaia's worship was widespread in early Greek religion. She was the source of all life, and prophecies often came from the earth itself. Pausanias, the ancient Greek traveler and geographer of the 2nd century AD, explicitly states that the oracle at Delphi initially belonged to Gaia. He writes that Gaia passed it to Themis, another ancient Titan goddess, who then passed it to Phoebe, and finally Phoebe gave it to Apollo. This mythical lineage points to a real historical succession of cults. Archaeological evidence supports the idea of an earlier pre-Apollonian presence. Early finds at Delphi, dating back to the Mycenaean period around 1600 to 1100 BC, suggest a cult focused on fertility and earth worship. These earlier cults often involved priestesses who communicated with the earth through caves or fissures. The Pythia's practice of sitting on a tripod over a chasm fits this older, chthonic model perfectly. It's a very earthy connection. The name Pythia itself is linked to Python, the serpent Apollo supposedly killed. Even in Apollo's domain, the memory of the older, snake-like, earth-bound deity persists. This isn't just a quaint historical detail. It means that the very roots of Delphi's power were deeply embedded in the ancient, often darker, worship of the earth. Apollo brought order, light, and reason, but he built his sanctuary on a foundation of raw, primordial earth power. This duality might explain some of the oracle's enduring mystique. If the oracle was originally tied to Gaia, did the Pythia's rituals or the interpretation of prophecies retain any elements of this older earth worship? How did the transition from an earth goddess cult to Apollo's cult affect the role and power of the priestesses? Are there any subtle hints in the later Apollonian rituals that point back to its more ancient chthonic origins? Number 13. How did Delphi handle prophecies that went wrong or simply failed? The Oracle of Delphi was famous for its accurate, if ambiguous, predictions. But what happened when things didn't go as planned? What about prophecies that simply failed or led to disastrous outcomes? An institution that lasted for over 1,000 years had to have a way to manage these failures. It couldn't always be right. One major strategy was ambiguity. The famous prophecy to Croesus that a great empire will be destroyed if he attacked Persia is a prime example. When it turned out to be his own empire, the oracle could simply say, "I told you so." The prophecy was technically true. The failure wasn't with Apollo, but with Croesus's interpretation. This allowed the oracle to maintain its infallibility. Herodotus, our main source for this story, shows how the oracle used this to its advantage. Another strategy was to demand more offerings or blame the consultant's impiety. If a prophecy didn't work out, it wasn't Apollo's fault. It was because the consultant hadn't made the proper sacrifices, hadn't purified themselves enough, or had offended a god in some way. This shifted the blame and ensured more revenue for the temple. Sometimes, a failed prophecy was simply reinterpreted or forgotten. The historical record is, of course, biased. Successful prophecies were recorded, celebrated, and widely publicized. By failed ones, not so much. People tend to remember the hits and forget the misses, especially when dealing with powerful religious institutions. We also know that Delphi faced skepticism and criticism. There were periods when its influence waned. Thucydides, the great historian of the Peloponnesian War, mentions prophecies but also questions their reliability. He shows that not everyone took them at face value, especially during times of war and political upheaval. This suggests that the oracle's authority wasn't absolute and unchallenged. Despite its long history, Delphi's reputation wasn't always spotless. There were instances of bribery or accusations of it. For example, during the Persian Wars, the Alcmaeonid family, exiled from Athens, allegedly bribed the Pythia to tell any Spartan embassy to prioritize the liberation of Athens. Whether true or not, the rumor itself shows that people were aware of the potential for manipulation. The oracle's survival depended on its perceived success. Managing failure was a sophisticated art form, blending ambiguity, blame shifting, and selective memory. It was about controlling the narrative and maintaining the mystique even when reality didn't quite line up. Were there ever official investigations into claims of failed prophecies or bribery at Delphi? Did the priests ever issue retractions or clarifications of previous prophecies that had gone spectacularly wrong? How did Delphi's critics or political opponents leverage instances of failed prophecy against the oracle? Or number 12, how did the oracle's power change over its 1,000-year history? The Oracle of Delphi wasn't a static institution. It changed a lot over its more than 1,000-year lifespan, from its mythical origins to its eventual decline under Roman rule. Understanding these shifts helps us see it as a living, evolving entity, not just a fixed point in history. In its earliest days, likely pre-8th century BC, it was probably a local shrine, perhaps to an earth goddess, with a priestess communicating through natural phenomena. It wasn't yet the Panhellenic power it would become. Its influence grew steadily during the Archaic period, 8th–6th centuries BC. This was the era of Greek colonization, and city-states frequently consulted Delphi on where to found new settlements. The oracle provided legitimacy and direction for these ambitious ventures. This period established its reputation as a crucial guide for the entire Greek world. Historians like John Boardman have extensively documented this era of rapid expansion. The classical period, 5th–4th centuries BC, was Delphi's golden age. It was at the height of its power. Kings, tyrants, and city-states from across the Mediterranean flocked there. Athens, Sparta, Croesus of Lydia serving all sought its advice on wars, laws, and major political decisions. The Persian Wars, with the oracle's crucial role, solidified its status. The Amphictyonic League, an alliance of Greek tribes, controlled the sanctuary during this time, further cementing its political importance. But even then, signs of change appeared. During the Peloponnesian War, as Thucydides noted, skepticism grew. The oracle's neutrality was questioned. Its pronouncements became more cautious, less decisive. Its advice became less direct, which helped it avoid being wrong but also made it less impactful. The Hellenistic period, 3rd–1st centuries BC, saw a decline. The rise of large, centralized kingdoms like Macedon meant that individual city-states had less autonomy and less need for a neutral arbitrator like Delphi. Kings relied more on their own power and less on divine guidance. Rome's growing influence also meant a different political landscape. While the Romans respected Delphi, their own state cults and auguries often took precedence. By the Roman imperial period, first 4th centuries AD, Delphi was largely a tourist attraction and a historical curiosity. It received imperial patronage, but its real political power was gone. Plutarch, living in Delphi as a priest, writes about the oracle's obsolescence, meaning its decline in activity and direct influence. He noted that the Pythia was consulted less often. The rise of Christianity eventually led to the oracle's final closure. Emperor Theodosius I, in 392 AD, banned pagan worship, and the Oracle of Delphi fell silent for good. This long sweep of history shows a dynamic institution. It adapted, evolved, and eventually faded, a victim of changing politics, religious beliefs, and possibly even geological shifts in the gas emissions. Did the oracle's physical appearance or rituals change significantly during its decline to try and regain influence? Were there attempts by later Greek or Roman emperors to revive Delphi's former glory, and if so, how successful were they? How did the local Delphian population cope with the loss of their primary source of income and prestige as the oracle declined? Number 11, beyond prophecy, was Delphi, also a major ancient library or archive. We think of Delphi as a place of prophecy, but it was more than that. It was a massive repository of knowledge, a kind of ancient archive and library. This aspect is often overlooked, but it highlights the intellectual and cultural importance of the site beyond just predicting the future. Every important city-state, every king, every general who consulted the oracle would have left records. These would include the questions asked, the offerings made, and the prophecies received. The priests of Delphi, as we discussed, were educated men. They meticulously recorded these interactions. Over centuries, these records would have accumulated into an enormous archive. Imagine thousands of questions, thousands of replies, all filed away. This would have been an unparalleled historical resource for the ancient world. Your Plutarch, as a priest, would have had access to some of these records. He mentions earlier works and traditions in his writings, but sadly, most of this vast library of knowledge is lost to us. Paper papyrus and other perishable materials don't survive well over millennia, especially in the conditions of ancient Greece. What remains are inscriptions on stone, fragments here and there. The treasuries along the sacred way weren't just for displaying offerings. They also likely held important documents, diplomatic records, and dedicatory inscriptions detailing the reasons for the offerings. Think of them as small, specialized archives maintained by individual city-states within the larger Delphian complex. The oracle wasn't just giving random advice. Its prophecies were often informed by past precedents. The priests, with access to these archives, could draw on a deep well of historical and political information. This would have allowed them to craft responses that were not just divinely inspired, but also historically astute and politically savvy. The ability to reference past prophecies or diplomatic exchanges would have given them immense credibility. Professor Scott's work on Delphi emphasizes its role as an information hub, not just a religious one. Consider the immense amount of information flow, consultants coming from all corners of the Greek world, bringing news, asking questions, and then taking prophecies back. Delphi was a central node in this ancient information network. Its archives would have held an incredible snapshot of ancient Greek history, politics, and daily life. The loss of these records is one of the greatest tragedies for our understanding of the ancient world. If Delphi had such an extensive archive, what kind of information might have been stored there besides prophecies? Could the loss of this archive be attributed to specific historical events like fires or sacks of the sanctuary? Did any ancient scholars or historians ever try to systematically catalog or study the Delphian archives before they were lost? Number 10, were there other oracles at Delphi besides the Pythia and Apollo? When we talk about the Oracle of Delphi, we mean the Pythia and Apollo. But was Apollo the only game in town? Were there other, lesser-known oracles or forms of divination happening simultaneously or earlier at Delphi? The answer is probably yes, showing a more diverse religious landscape than the dominant narrative suggests. As we discussed, the site was originally associated with Gaia, the Earth Mother. Her prophecies would have been delivered in a different way, possibly through dreams or omens from the Earth itself. This suggests a very different kind of divinatory practice before Apollo took over. The remnants of this older tradition, like the chthonic gases, may have been incorporated into Apollo's cult, but the original methods could have involved other forms of divination. There's also evidence of other minor cults and deities at Delphi. For instance, the cult of Dionysus was also present. Dionysus, the god of wine, ecstasy, and theater, had his own temple, or at least a sacred space, at Delphi. Plutarch mentions that during the winter months, when Apollo was believed to be absent, Dionysus took precedence. While Dionysus wasn't primarily a god of prophecy like Apollo, his ecstatic rites and connection to altered states of consciousness could have led to different forms of divination, perhaps less formal than the Pythias. Dream interpretation was also a common form of divination in the ancient world. Many temples had dormitories known as abata or encoimateria where pilgrims could sleep, hoping to receive divine messages in their dreams. While not as prominent as the Pythia's oracle, it's highly likely that Delphi, as a major religious center, offered such services to some extent. People would have come with their dreams to be interpreted by priests. Then there were the various omens and signs that priests everywhere interpreted. The flight of birds, the entrails of sacrificed animals, haruspicy, thunder, and lightning. These were all considered messages from the gods. While not oracles in the sense of a speaking deity, these were daily practices of divination that would have taken place at Delphi alongside the Pythia's pronouncements. The dominant narrative of Apollo and the Pythia overshadows these other practices. But a closer look shows that Delphi was a complex religious ecosystem with multiple forms of seeking divine will. Apollo's cult became the most famous and powerful, but it wasn't necessarily the only channel for prophecy or divine communication at the site. Were there ever tensions or conflicts between the different cults or divinatory practices at Delphi? Did the prominence of Dionysus in winter months affect the types of questions asked or the nature of the prophecies received? Could some of the secrets of the Pythia's methods have been borrowed or adapted from these older or parallel divinatory traditions? Number 9, what did the consultation process really look like for an average person? We often hear about kings asking the oracle, but what about the common person? The full consultation process was elaborate, expensive, and not for everyone. One formal ritualized experience designed to maximize awe and minimize direct interaction with the Pythia. First, you had to arrive in Delphi. This itself was a journey, often long and difficult. You would register your intent to consult. Then came the sacrifices. You didn't just walk up. You had to make specific offerings, often animals, which were costly. The priests would inspect the entrails of these animals for favorable omens. If the omens were bad, you might have to try again the next day, with more sacrifices. This could add up. Then came the waiting. The oracle wasn't open every day. It generally operated on the 7th day of the month for 9 months of the year, with Apollo supposedly absent in the winter. And even on those days, there was a queue. Important people, city-states, and those who had made significant donations, proxenoi, got priority. The average person might wait days, even weeks. Professor Lisa Maurizio details this complex process in her studies of the Pythia. When your turn finally came, you might not even speak directly to the Pythia. You would usually present your question to the male priests, the propheti. They would then formalize it, often into a yes-no question or a choice between 2 options. This limited the scope and made the Pythia's job easier, or at least more manageable. You were then led into the Adaton, the inner sanctum. This was usually a small, dark, and probably incense-filled space. You wouldn't see much, if anything, of the Pythia. She sat on her tripod behind a curtain or partition. Her voice might be muffled, distant. She would utter her prophecy. These words were often ambiguous, sometimes in a strange meter or rhythm. You might not understand them fully. Then you would return to the priests. They would interpret her words, formalize them into the hexameter verse we know today, and write them down for you. This written record was your oracle. It's clear that the priests played a crucial role at every step, shaping the experience and the message. The entire process was designed to reinforce the oracle's authority and mystique, making the consultant feel small and dependent on the divine and priestly guidance. Could a common person ever afford multiple consultations if the initial omens were bad? Did the priests ever refuse to formalize a question or edit it significantly before presenting it to the Pythia? How did the experience differ for women consulting the oracle compared to men? Number 8, the myth of the oracle's infallibility. How often was it actually wrong? The Oracle of Delphi gained legendary status because of its perceived infallibility. People believed Apollo could not be wrong. This idea was central to its power. But was it truly infallible? History suggests a more nuanced picture. The oracle was wrong, or at least its prophecies led to terrible outcomes, more often than the popular narrative admits. Take, for instance, the story of Lycurgus, the legendary lawgiver of Sparta. He supposedly consulted Delphi about his new laws. The oracle declared his laws divine and excellent. Yet, Sparta ultimately suffered defeats and internal strife, arguably because of the very system Lycurgus put in place. The oracle's divine blessing didn't guarantee success. Another example is the Sicilian expedition, a disastrous Athenian military campaign during the Peloponnesian War. The oracle apparently advised the Athenians to go, promising success. The result was a catastrophic defeat that crippled Athens. Thucydides, who documented this war, often implies that the oracle's prophecies were vague or outright unhelpful in critical situations. He questioned the divine guidance, showing that contemporaries weren't always convinced of its perfect accuracy. The oracle's main defense against being wrong, as we discussed, was ambiguity. By giving vague predictions like a great empire will be destroyed, it could claim to be right no matter the outcome. This was a brilliant strategy for self-preservation, but it meant the oracle often didn't provide clear, actionable advice. Sometimes the oracle might have been strategically wrong, or at least provided advice that served its own political interests. When the Persians invaded, Delphi initially urged the Greeks to surrender. This might have been a pragmatic move to save its own sanctuary, knowing that resistance might lead to destruction. When the Greeks decided to fight, the oracle shifted its tone. Its infallibility was often less about absolute truth and more about maintaining its prestige and survival in a complex political landscape. The oracle's pronouncements were always filtered through human agents, so the Pythia and the priests, who had their own biases, knowledge, and survival instincts. The very fact that historical figures like Croesus and Lycurgus are remembered for their interactions with the oracle, even when things went south, shows that the oracle wasn't always correct in a straightforward way. Its power lay not in never being wrong, but in its ability to spin any outcome back to its divine wisdom. Were there ever documented instances where a consultant directly challenged the oracle for a failed prophecy? How did the priests explain instances where Apollo's advice seemed to lead to disaster rather than success? Did the oracle's perceived infallibility decrease over time, especially during periods of political turmoil or military defeat for the Greeks? Number 7. How did the Delphians live around such a sacred, powerful place? Imagine living in Delphi. You weren't just a bystander, you were part of the fabric of this most sacred site. The Delphians, the people who lived in the town surrounding the sanctuary, had a unique existence, deeply intertwined with the oracle's operations and fame. Their lives were shaped by the constant stream of pilgrims, the immense wealth, and the demanding rituals of the temple. Economically, Delphi was a boomtown. The pilgrims needed lodging, food, guides, and offerings. This created a robust local economy. Delphians would have been innkeepers, merchants, artisans, and laborers for the temple. The sacred games, the Pythian Games, held every 4 years, brought even more visitors, and boosted the local economy further. Living in Delphi was probably a comfortable existence for many, thanks to the oracle. Socially, the Delphians held a special status. They were guardians of the oracle, inhabitants of Apollo's sacred domain. This gave them prestige among other Greek city-states. They were generally considered neutral, often protected by the Amphictyonic League, which helped them avoid direct involvement in many Greek wars. This neutrality was crucial for the oracle's reputation. However, living so close to divine power also came with responsibilities and restrictions. The Delphians were expected to uphold certain standards of piety and cleanliness. Their town was essentially an extension of the sanctuary. They had to ensure the smooth running of the oracle, assisting the priests and participating in rituals. Plutarch, a native Delphian, offers a unique insight into this life, highlighting the blend of sacred duty and daily living. He served as a priest himself, demonstrating the deep connection between the local community and the oracle. The selection of the Pythia also came from within the Delphian community. This meant that any family could potentially have one of their women chosen for the highest religious office, a great honor, but also a permanent change in that woman's life and her family's status. The connection was deep and personal. Despite its wealth, Delphi remained a relatively small town. Its primary purpose was religious. Its inhabitants were dedicated to its upkeep and operation. This gave the community a strong sense of identity and purpose, centered entirely around the oracle. They were more than just villagers, they were the custodians of the center of the world. Did the Delphians resent the constant influx of foreigners and their demands, or did they embrace it as their way of life? Were there social classes or hierarchies within the Delphian community based on their proximity or role within the oracle's operations. How did the Delphians manage to maintain their neutrality in a perpetually warring Greek world? Number 6, the forgotten role of women. Beyond the Pythia, were there other priestesses? When we think of Delphi, we think of the Pythia, the one woman central to its fame. But was she the only woman involved in the oracle's operation? Probably not. The focus on the Pythia has overshadowed the potential roles of other women at Delphi, suggesting a more complex female presence than typically acknowledged. Firstly, the Pythia herself likely didn't operate in total isolation. While the chief priests were men, there would have been other temple attendants. Many ancient temples, particularly those dedicated to goddesses or earth cults, had multiple priestesses or female temple servants. Given Delphi's pre-Apollonian roots with Gaia, it's plausible that remnants of these earlier female-led cults persisted. These women might have assisted the Pythia, prepared her for rituals, or maintained the sacred space around the Ataton. Their roles might not have been recorded in the same way as the Pythia's, but they would have been essential. Secondly, the very act of the Pythia being a woman is significant. Many ancient oracles featured female figures, and women were often seen as being more receptive to divine influence, closer to the earth and its chthonic powers. This societal perception might have led to a broader involvement of women in various ancillary religious roles at Delphi, even if not directly involved in prophecy. We have scattered evidence of other women in religious roles in ancient Greece. For instance, the cults of Demeter and Persephone at Eleusis had prominent female priestesses. While Delphi was primarily Apollonian, it might have incorporated female roles from different religious traditions, especially as it grew and absorbed various cults. Professor Maurizio's work also touches on the broader context of women in ancient Greek religion, suggesting that their roles were more diverse than often portrayed. The focus on the male propheti and the singular Pythia often simplifies the reality. It's hard to imagine a complex, millennia-old institution like Delphi functioning with only one woman and a few male priests. There would have been a hierarchy of roles, and it's very likely that other women in less prominent positions helped sustain the daily operations and rituals of the sanctuary. Their names and specific duties are lost to history, but their presence is a reasonable inference given the size and nature of the institution. What specific tasks or rituals might these other women have performed within the sanctuary? Did their roles change over time, especially as the Pythia's status evolved? Could the stories of the Pythia's selection, which sometimes implied a pool of potential candidates, suggest a larger female community associated with the oracle? Number 5. The sacred spring of Castalia, more than just holy water. The Castalian spring at Delphi is famous. It's where the Pythian consultants purified themselves before approaching the temple. Its waters were considered sacred, essential for ritual cleansing. But was it just holy water, or did the spring have a deeper significance, perhaps even a physical effect that we don't fully appreciate today? The spring itself is beautiful, flowing from a cleft in the rocks of Mount Parnassus. The ancients built a fountain house around it, making it a focal point for purification. For the Pythia, bathing in its waters was a crucial preliminary ritual. For consultants, simply washing their hands and feet was required before entering the sanctuary. This act of purification wasn't just symbolic. It was believed to cleanse the mind and body, preparing one to encounter the divine. But what if the water itself had subtle properties? The spring is located on a fault line. Water that flows through such geological formations can pick up minerals. Some researchers have speculated about the presence of trace elements or natural chemicals in the water that might have had a mild psychoactive or relaxing effect. While there's no conclusive scientific proof for this, it's an intriguing idea, especially considering the Pythia's use of the water and the overall atmosphere of the place. The idea of sacred waters is common across many ancient cultures. Such waters were often believed to have healing properties or to enhance spiritual receptivity. The Castalian spring would have been no different. It wasn't just water, it was divine water, imbued with the spirit of the place. John Hale's research connecting geology to the oracle also considers the spring in its broader geological context. The water can facilitate the release and transport of gases, which further ties the spring to the gas theories. Beyond its physical properties, the spring played a vital psychological role. The act of purification of washing away the mundane would have focused the mind. It would have heightened anticipation and prepared the individual for a profound experience. It was a liminal space marking the transition from the ordinary to the sacred. The sounds of the flowing water, the cool mist, the ritual movements all contributed to creating a specific mental state conducive to seeking prophecy. If the water contained specific minerals, could it have subtly influenced the Pythia's physical or mental state? Were there specific chants or prayers recited while purifying oneself at the Castalian spring, which are now lost to us? How did the purity and flow of the spring water change over time? And did this affect the rituals or the oracle's effectiveness? Number 4, the Delphian Sibyl, was she a real person or a competing tradition? Many people confuse the Pythia with the Sibyl. The Delphian Sibyl is a distinct figure in myth, often conflated with the Pythia. But was she a real historical person who prophesied at Delphi, or was she a legendary figure representing an older, possibly competing prophetic tradition? Understanding this distinction is key to untangling the layers of Delphian prophecy. The Sibyls were legendary prophetesses, often described as wilder and more ecstatic than the Pythia. They were not tied to a specific temple or cult. There were many Sibyls across the ancient world: the Cumaean Sibyl, the Erythraean Sibyl, and yes, the Delphian Sibyl. Their prophecies were often recorded in books, Sibylline books, and consulted by Roman officials during times of crisis. These books were seen as very ancient and powerful. The Delphian Sibyl specifically is a figure shrouded in myth. Pausanias describes her as a woman named Herophile who lived before the Trojan War. He says she was not a Pythia. She traveled offering prophecies in various places. Her prophecies were delivered in hexameter verse, much like Apollo's, but she did not sit on the tripod or use the vapor. She was seen as inspired directly by a god, or gods, in a more personal, itinerant way. The existence of a Delphian Sibyl suggests a tradition of independent prophetesses at or near Delphi, distinct from the formal Apollonian oracle. This is important because it implies that Apollo's oracle, while dominant, might not have been the only source of prophecy in the region. There could have been informal, perhaps even rogue, prophetic figures operating alongside the official institution. Some scholars argue that the Sibyls represent an older, more informal, or even outsider form of prophecy compared to the institutionalized oracle. They were often described as long-lived, almost immortal, further emphasizing their legendary status. They were not chosen by priests, they were simply born with the gift. This distinction matters because it shows that ancient Greek society had multiple ways of thinking about and seeking divine communication. The Pythia was state-sanctioned and institutionalized. The Sibyl was wilder, more ancient, and less controlled. The scholarly work of scholars like H.W. Park and J.R. Wormel often addresses this distinction, clarifying the unique roles. The Sibyl's story reminds us that the Oracle of Delphi, for all its power, was part of a broader landscape of ancient Greek religious beliefs and practices. It wasn't a monopoly on prophecy. Even if it was the most famous player, could the legend of the Delphian Sibyl have been a way for the Apollonian oracle to acknowledge or even absorb older, pre-existing prophetic traditions at the site? Was there ever any tension or competition between the official Pythia and any supposed Sibyls who might have operated in the region? How did the style and content of a Sibyl's prophecy differ from that of the Pythia? And did people prefer one over the other in different contexts? Number 3, what happened to all the gold and treasure? The lost wealth of Delphi. Delphi was incredibly wealthy. We've talked about the treasuries, the gifts from kings, the offerings from city-states. Gold and silver flowed into the sanctuary for centuries. It was essentially the ancient world's Fort Knox. But where is all that wealth today? The vast majority of it is gone. Its disappearance is one of the biggest mysteries. The treasuries themselves, like the Athenian treasury, were filled with statues, votive offerings, and precious objects. These weren't just symbolic gestures, they were real, tangible assets. Imagine entire rooms packed with gold and silver dedications. The historian Herodotus describes the immense wealth of King Croesus's offerings, which included gold lions, bulls, and even gold bricks. Many states would deposit their surplus wealth at Delphi for safekeeping, treating it as a divine bank. So, what happened? The short answer is it was stolen, melted down, and lost to time. Delphi, despite its sacred status, was not immune to conflict. It was sacked multiple times throughout its history. One of the most significant destructions occurred during the Third Sacred War, 356 to 346 BC. Phocis, a neighboring state, seized control of the sanctuary and used its immense treasures to fund their war effort. They melted down gold and silver dedications to pay their mercenary armies. This was a massive act of desecration, but a desperate military necessity. Diodorus Siculus recounts this event in detail, noting the scandal and outrage it caused across Greece. Later, the Romans, while generally respectful of Delphi, also took some treasures. When the Roman general Sulla sacked Athens in 86 BC, he also plundered Delphi to fund his campaigns. And many of the finest statues and artworks were eventually taken to Rome over the centuries, as was common practice for victorious empires. Finally, the end of paganism under the Roman Empire meant the end of Delphi's revenue stream. Without pilgrims and offerings, the sanctuary gradually fell into ruin. Whatever remaining treasures were left were likely plundered by various groups over the following centuries, or simply buried and forgotten as the site was abandoned and covered by earth. The few pieces we have today in the Delphi Museum are just a tiny fraction of what once existed. The vast majority of the center of the world's wealth is simply gone. How much of Delphi's treasure was actually moved to other locations for safekeeping during times of peace, only to be lost later? Are there any rumors or legends about undiscovered caches of Delphian wealth hidden away before the major destructions? Did any city-states attempt to reclaim their specific dedications or deposits from Delphi after it was plundered? Number 2. The hidden underground labyrinth or passage beneath the temple. The Temple of Apollo at Delphi sits on a complex geological site. We know about the fault lines and the gases, but there's a persistent, almost folkloric idea of a hidden underground labyrinth or secret passage beneath the temple. Is there any truth to this? While not a labyrinth in the Minoan sense, the topography and ancient construction might hint at something more. Archaeological excavations at Delphi have revealed a very complex substructure beneath the main temple. The Adyton, where the Pythia sat, was not simply a room on flat ground. It was built over fissured bedrock. Ancient engineers were masters of working with the landscape. They would have needed foundations that could cope with seismic activity and the unique geological features. Some theories suggest that the chasm from which the pneuma rose wasn't a gaping hole visible to everyone. Instead, it might have been a system of narrow fissures or even man-made channels designed to funnel the gases into the Adyton. This would have required underground work, perhaps small tunnels or conduits, to manage the flow. Such structures wouldn't be a labyrinth for navigation, but a functional, hidden system. Early excavators unfamiliar with the geology might have missed these subtle features or dismissed them as natural irregularities. Modern geological surveys, using ground-penetrating radar and seismic imaging, could potentially reveal such hidden structures. While no grand labyrinth has been found, the idea of engineered or modified subterranean spaces to control gas flow is not far-fetched given the ancient Greeks' sophisticated engineering skills. The stories of secret passages often arise from the desire to explain the mysterious. How did the oracle work? A hidden passage implies a secret, perhaps human, manipulation. While direct manipulation of the Pythia likely happened through the priests, the physical manipulation of the environment to enhance her trance could involve hidden features. The layout of the Adyton itself, often described as a small, enclosed space, hints at a deliberate design to concentrate the effects of the pneuma. The hidden aspect also plays into the mystique. What you can't see is often more powerful. If there were any small, inaccessible spaces or channels beneath the Pythia's tripod, they would have fueled the legends. The idea of direct interaction with the Earth's raw power, funneled through unseen means, would have only added to the oracle's awe-inspiring reputation. Could the priests have used any such hidden passages for their own rituals, or to amplify the perceived effects on the Pythia? Are there any ancient texts that subtly hint at engineered substructures beneath the temple beyond mere foundations? If such passages exist, could they have been used to create specific acoustic effects or visual illusions within the Adyton? Number 1. The oracle's final days, was it a slow fade or a sudden silence? The Oracle of Delphi didn't end with a bang. There wasn't a sudden dramatic moment when Apollo abandoned his temple. Instead, it was a long, slow decline, a gradual fade into silence over centuries. This makes its end more poignant, showing the power of changing beliefs and shifting empires. By the 1st century AD, when Plutarch was a priest there, the oracle was already much less active. He writes that the Pythia was consulted infrequently. The great stream of pilgrims had dwindled. The political power of individual Greek city-states had been subsumed by the Roman Empire. The Romans often had their own forms of divination, and their emperors consolidated power, rarely needing external divine approval for their actions. Christianity also began to rise. As the new religion spread, pagan cults like Apollos lost followers. Christians actively campaigned against pagan worship, viewing it as demonic. The old gods were seen as false idols. This erosion of belief slowly starved Delphi of its spiritual and financial lifeblood. The definitive end came with a series of Roman imperial decrees. In the late 4th century AD, Emperor Theodosius they issued edicts that effectively banned all pagan cults. In 392 AD, he specifically prohibited pagan sacrifices and temple worship. This was the final blow. The doors of the Temple of Apollo would have been closed, the rituals ceased, and the Pythia silenced for good. There's a famous, perhaps apocryphal, story about the last recorded oracle. Julian, the apostate, a Roman emperor who tried to revive paganism in the mid-4th century AD, supposedly sent a physician to Delphi. The Pythia's reply was melancholy: "Tell the king that the adorned house has fallen to the ground. Phoebus Apollo no longer has his hut, nor a prophetic laurel, nor a speaking spring. The water's voice is dead." This prophecy, whether real or a later literary invention, perfectly captures a sense of loss and finality. It speaks of a dying god and a fading world. Delphi didn't suffer one final, glorious destruction that people remember. It suffered a slow, quiet death, a decay into oblivion as its world changed around it. The great prophecies ceased, not with a divine thunderbolt, but with the quiet closing of temple doors, abandoned by the very people who once flocked to its wisdom. Could the final decline of the oracle have been hastened by a reduction in the geological gases, effectively removing the Pythia's means of trance? Were there any attempts by local Delphians or priests to secretly continue pagan practices after the official bans, and what were the consequences? What became of the last Pythia after the oracle was definitively closed? Did she simply return to a normal life, or was her fate more tragic?